That's what's up.
All right, so before we begin, I just want to thank everyone, especially my team, Nidhi, Isha, Amanda, Hannah, Ria, and Tanaya, my coaches here, Miranda and Mr. Garrett, all our teammates and coaches back home, our graduated team, Tal and Manoush, for inspiring us to get to finals just like they did last year, our family and friends. It's amazing to see three women in finals of TOC, quarter bid tournament, and PF, promoting diversity debate. Thank you to our opponents, Alan and Ahana, two of the kindest debaters on the circuit and our very good friends, and the judges for spending their Saturday night here at Alta allowing us to debate. With that being said, are all my judges ready? Yeah? Wait for you. All right. Awesome. Megan and I affirmed the resolution. The United States should require universal background checks for all gun sales and transfers of ownership. Our sole contention is closing loopholes. There are 4 warrants as to how passing universal background checks uniquely closes current loopholes in gun control policy. The first is private sales. By applying to all gun sales and transfers of ownership, universal background checks cover a key hole left by the lack of background checks on private sales. Wintermute of UC Davis writes in 2013 that many of the failures of past gun control policies can be attributed to the fact that they were not applied to private firearm transfers, which account for 40% of all transfers and 95% of transfers to people who commit firearm-related crimes. The second warrant is increasing prices. Sherifinsky writes for the Washington Times in 2013 that expanded background checks would drive up costs to the consumer as dealers are forced to conduct background checks. Bandler quantifies in 2015 that background checks can add up to $200 to the cost of a gun. D. Philippus of Princeton writes in 2015 that this impact spills over into the black market. As he writes, the regulations on guns typically also drive up prices in illegal venues because the flow of weapons on the black market is directly controlled by the flow of weapons in the legal market. Because of an increase in prices, D. Philippus continues that criminals will likely be deterred from obtaining firearms. The third warrant is deterrence. Passing universal background checks makes lying on a background check or selling to a person who cannot pass a background check a federally prosecutable offense, which acts as a strong deterrent against both sellers and buyers who cannot pass a background check. D. Philippus of the Trace writes in 2017 that the mere act of lying on a background check constitutes a felony charge with a penalty of up to 10 years imprisonment. Kirkham writes for the Huffington Post in 2012 that empirically in states such as California that have mandated background checks, sellers are held more accountable because guns found at a crime scene could be traced back to them and they were held liable. Meanwhile, in states without background checks, authorities have little leverage over keeping sellers from selling to dangerous individuals. Because of these two factors, Martinez writes for CNN in 2013 that the presence of background checks deters people who would likely fail from even attempting to purchase the gun in the first place. The fourth warrant is interstate trafficking. D. Philippus of the Trace writes in 2015 that the major flaw of most state gun control policies is that trafficking simply spreads to other areas. Asher 538 confirms in 2017 that 60% of the guns used in Chicago, which has universal background checks, originate from Indiana and Wisconsin, 2 states with extremely lax gun laws. Universal background checks solve by creating uniform state gun control policies, which both reduces in-state gun trafficking and prevents it from simply spreading to other states. Wintermute of UC Davis quantifies in 2013 that gun trafficking is 2.4 times higher in states without comprehensive background checks than in states with them. The impact here is decreasing violence. There are 2 ways universal background checks decrease violence. The first is homicides. Empirically, background checks have worked well in terms of reducing homicides. Castleman finds in 2017 that in 2007, Missouri repealed a law requiring background checks for all gun purchases. This repeal led to a 23% increase in gun homicide. However, when Connecticut adopted a background check law similar to the one Missouri had just repealed, gun homicides actually fell by 40%. The second impact is intimate partner violence. According to the NCGW in 2016, 52% of women murdered with guns are murdered by their intimate partners. Sergeant of the Washington Post quantifies in 2013 that state laws prohibiting individuals under a domestic violence restraining order from owning guns produced an overall 19% reduction in intimate partner homicides. But even furthermore, Lopez from Vox News writes in 2017 that men who commit violence rehearse it and perfect it against their families first. Women and children are the target practice, and the home is the training ground for these men's later actions. This is why the Orlando, Planned Parenthood, and most recent Texas shootings all had shooters who were accused of domestic violence in the past. Passing universal background checks, which prohibit criminals convicted of intimate partner violence, therefore not only reduces the amount of violence against women, but also decreases the probability of mass shootings ever happening. In order to prevent mass shootings, decrease homicide rates, and combat gender oppression by saving the lives of women everywhere, please affirm.
My thank yous are a little long for my one. Yeah, I'll just read it.
I won't remember any thank yous.
Okay. So first of all, thank you to Alan. I've told you this a lot of times, but you're practically the only reason I solo debate. And your passion for the activity is pretty inspiring, even though you drive pretty much everybody insane. Second of all, thank you to my teammates, everyone that's here this tournament, especially Franklin, you're my inspiration. Thank you to Keya for being my debate sister and daughter, etc. Anik, Vineela, good job this tournament, and Rahi, you're going places. Also, shout out to Sai, who's not here. Thanks to our coaches. Sam, who's not here, even though you sleep during our rounds, I still appreciate your help, I guess. Mr. Pine, who is here, and Miss Shaw, who's not here. You guys are the only reason that we get to compete on the level that you do, and especially being a small school, having your support is, like, just amazing. And then lastly, shout out to Lauren and Megan for being amazing female debaters who just represent everything that I hope that other female debaters can see and emulate and want to keep debating. So, thanks. With that, is everyone ready? Okay. We negate. Our sole contention is shell-shocking American politics. Subpoint A is the short-term counterbalance. Gaudano 17 of USA Today reports that the NRA opposes any policy that expands background checks. Gurney 13 of the Daily Beast thus observes that when the NRA recognizes that it is unable to stop a new law requiring universal background checks, it will undermine the law by pushing for loopholes to make enforcement of the new policy impossible. A vote for the affirmative is a vote for this poison bill. For example, Gambino 16 of The Guardian explains that Congress and the NRA retaliate against gun measures by taking money from the ATF. This is problematic because the ATF attacks the root cause of illegal sales. Noise of PBS quantifies that only 8% of firearm dealers are responsible for the majority of handguns used in crimes. These licensed retailers are entrepreneurs tempted by the big profits of gun trafficking. As a result, they illegally sell firearms to drive up their earnings. The ATF has shifted their strategies to specifically target these dealers. Unfortunately, a cut in funding would cut these law enforcement efforts. Subpoint B is a long-term backlash. A universal background check bill would uproot the American political system in two ways. First, by eliminating moderates. Ben Shahar 17 of Forbes magazine reports that despite the seemingly loaded deck of a unified Republican government, voices of dissent in the party prevent extreme policies from passing. Unfortunately, Hopkins 16 of Boston College warns that the number of moderate incumbents facing primary challenges on the basis of a lack of party loyalty has risen sharply, now constituting more than 40% of all contested races. For a universal background check bill to be passed, Republicans would have to vote for it. This would be seen as betrayal, prompting the NRA to support these moderate challengers in upcoming primaries. Sirpin 06 of the Naval Postgraduate School explains that previous losses on gun control have caused the NRA to refocus its efforts into changing the political landscape in national elections. After the passage of gun control laws, the NRA creates a hit list of Republicans who supported the bill. Sirpin observes that when gun laws were passed in 2014, the NRA was successful in removing 72% of the politicians on their lists. Even without physically acting, the fear of NRA intervention influences policymakers. Scott 15 of the University of Utah concludes that the NRA is perceived by politicians to be a dangerous group that can push out anyone who votes against their interpretation of the Second Amendment. Second is by forcing an appeal to the base. Thou 16 of Penn State explains that federal gun laws will result in backlash from the pro-gun community. Even if the majority of Americans and NRA members support universal background checks, Spitzer 15 of Cornell University explains that gun rights supporters are much more likely to vote solely on gun issues and are more politically active. Moreover, Donahue 13 of CNN finds that gun manufacturers are the largest influencers of gun policy and are staunchly opposed to any policy that appears to reduce gun sales. Because of this activism gap, Spitzer finds that politicians are forced to pander to this passionate minority. The impact is destructive policymaking. The passage of a universal background check bill would inevitably lead to a give-and-take situation where a pro-gun piece of legislation would be passed as well. Hayes 17 of Newsweek explains that following recent mass shootings, Republicans would only support increased gun regulation in exchange for expansion of concealed carry rights, specifically concealed carry reciprocity between states. This is problematic, as Brown 17 of the New York Times explains that this would pave the way for hundreds of thousands of more guns to be brought into U.S. cities with more stringent gun laws. On the whole, Donahue 17 of Stanford University finds that concealed carry laws increase violent crime by between 13 to 15%. The harms of this backlash extends beyond one policy. Winkler 13 of UCLA observes that the NRA sets up gun legislation to fail. Then, when the law predictably fails to meaningfully reduce gun violence, the NRA cites it as evidence that gun control doesn't work. This causes people to become disillusioned with the idea of any gun control being effective, perpetuating the NRA's narrative. Lighton 09 of the University of Michigan explains that social movements are squashed by the NRA because it mobilizes grassroots opposition to gun control using extremist rhetoric and intensive lobbying. Thus, we negate.
Paper cross? Okay, can I have the first question?
of course.
All right, so at the bottom of your case, you talk about concealed carry rights.
Yeah.
Is the NRA currently pushing for these rights right now?
I would say that every time in the past that they've tried, or like recently, like after the Texas shooting or recent mass shootings, when we've tried to pass or like any kind of gun legislation, you've seen that like Republicans have tried to attach.
Right, but these NRA members, right, they still are pushing for concealed carry gun rights right now, right?
That's not about NRA members. That's just about Republicans in Congress.
All right, well, Republicans in Congress then, they're already pushing for these right now. It's happening in the status quo, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say that by inherently passing universal background check using the fiat power of the AF, you're also passing those laws.
Okay.
So can I have a question about your first contention, talking about the increasing, like the second link, talking about the increase in prices, right?
Right.
So even if there is like an increase in price, how do you know that like specifically for criminals, gun prices are like the demand for guns are elastic?
Right, so basically what we're saying here is that like the demand for guns is inelastic, right? Because criminals need to get their guns somehow. And even on the black market, even in illegal venues, they still need to pay a certain sum for these guns. And so like that's why we're saying like increasing prices is inherently bad, because then criminals won't even have the cost of producing
themselves that they need to get their guns somehow.
Right.
So how does inherently an increase in price by like how much, like how does that stop someone who needs a gun from getting a gun?
Well,
They
because
just pay the extra money.
Because they how can they pay the extra money if they don't have it in the first place?
How do you know they don't have it?
Well, I would contend that like a lot of criminals, like poverty breeds crime, so a lot of these criminals come from like low income backgrounds. But even furthermore, it still decreases demand when it increases.
But I would say that if they need crime to like have their livelihood, they would still pay the money.
Well, I mean, not all of them need to kill people for their livelihood. It's not always about guns for their livelihood.
No, you don't need to kill people for your livelihood, but in order to conduct crimes, you need a gun because it makes you more powerful.
Right, but I'm saying like it's like if they can't afford the
easier.
gun, they're not going to get it in either role. Can I have the next question?
Yeah.
All right. So when you talk about how the NRA will push for loopholes in Congress right now, so like, have they been successful like in any like specific?
Yeah, you can read our evidence, but like the Brady bill, for example, the Teller Amendment basically made it impossible to enforce.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about the Brady bill really quickly. After the Brady bill, was a wave of gun control policies passed?
I don't know, I'm sure you can tell me.
Yeah, so in the 1990s, right after the Brady bill, a huge wave of gun control policies were passed in states, which kind of proves that NRA backlash is kind of not unique, because you yourself tell me that NRA backlash happened after the Brady bill. Yeah, we saw a huge surge in gun control policies being passed.
So why do we need a failed policy to pass at the federal level for state policy to be passed?
Well, I'm not saying we need it, but I'm just saying that your impact of no policies being fully passed in states is not true.
Your impact to this like turn or whatever is not unique because it can happen either way.
How?
I would say that inherently.
How can it happen either way?
So like I would say that like right now, like maybe in states they're already passing like gun control legislation that you don't need to pass a universal background check to like build a movement or something.
But like that's only liberal states, right? And conservative states are not passing as much gun control.
So you're saying that by passing a universal background check, we're going to pass gun control in conservative states as well?
Yeah, that's literally what a federal background check is. It's going to apply to all states, including those who are
I thought you were
conservative.
talking about support for other gun control policies.
Right, so that's a separate argument. You're talking about the Brady bill, and I was saying that your NRA backlash argument doesn't actually happen in real life because after the Brady bill, there were tons of gun control policies passed, proving that the NRA doesn't have that much power. But you can have next. Oh, that's cross.
Wow. I don't need it anyways, it's fine.
Well,
I can put it back together for you.
yeah, we can fix it
That's
together.
my first thank you, Ahana, for putting the laptop stand back together. All the student opponents were like, we're really clumsy, and I was like, I don't think you know. Oh no, this isn't recording too.
It's okay, Conrad's fell last year.
There we go. Wait.
It's a tradition.
That was literally like.
That's because it's not in Titan.
I think that's
Okay,
I
we're
did
just
it.
gonna take these off.
Okay.
Okay, like Ahana, my thank yous are a little bit long, but they're all very important, so I think they all deserve time. That's my black spot. Okay, my first thank you is to Alan and Ahana for being literally the sweetest debaters on the circuit. Anything you ever need, they give you. There's no one I would rather final with, especially because Alan is wearing this suit. And because this is the final showdown of CFL versus GGSA, and whoever wins this round is winning California State.
That's too much pressure.
The second thank you is to... Oh, God. The second thing... Actually, we're not going to States. Sorry. Second thank you is Miranda. Literally the best coach I could have ever asked for. This final is 50% your work. All of the flows you get for us, all the prep you do for us. You are definitely not insignificant. Please don't drop about me for saying that. You do so much, not only for us, but for all of the younger girls on our team, teaching them to be unapologetically good female debaters. Also, Brandon Garrett for being the only reason that we could, as a small all-female girls debate team, get to final rounds like this and go to tournaments like this. You're amazing. You're the best ally for women in debate. Third, thank you, Alta, for these very nice first and second speaker plaques over here, just to flex. Fourth is to USC because I spent the first half of this tournament writing my essay. If you don't accept me at this point, I don't know what else I could have done. The fifth is to my judges. We appreciate you a lot for spending this late night here with us, and please don't drop us for anything our coach said. We love her, but we hate her sometimes. No, I'm kidding, we don't. Okay, now is everybody ready? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh no. It's just gonna go overview, you can flow on their case, then down their case. Okay, I'll start my time now. Realize the best they can do is impact your liberal states that already have gun control policies. The reason you affirm is that you apply these federal policies to conservative states as well. Even if they win all of their offense, we win risk of offense on the 23 conservative states in America, as well as the three swing states that they can't impact. Realize you vote right there because liberal states have gun control policy no matter whether you affirm or negate. It's conservative states that we need to at least put the risk of offense of gun control policy on. But then onto their only contention of shell shocking. The first thing they talk about is short-term backlash. Now, the NRA will attach riders and loopholes. Realize this is non-unique. The NRA always attaches riders to any form of gun control. To say we should never pass anything that has a rider on it is to say we should never pass gun control at all. However, realize that even if the NRA... Wait, I was not timing that. Were you guys?
No.
Okay.
I was. You're at 1 minute 30.
1 minute 33?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll start from there. Okay. However, even if the NRA lobbies against gun control, no matter whether you affirm or negate, the affirmative provides you 3 unique ways that we solve. The first one comes from Senator Chris Murphy in 2017, who says that the only reason the NRA has power is because they're able to mobilize voters to get out for senators that they lobby. However, the way that they get these voters out is by telling them, look at all this gun violence out here. That's why you need guns. That's why you need to fight against politicians who want to pass restrictive gun laws. However, when we empirically decrease gun violence, the NRA loses the scapegoat that they use to point at and mobilize voters. We uniquely decrease the NRA. The second turn comes from Sarah Trumbull in 2013, who tells you that when the NRA fights against a popular bill, their support actually lessens by 40% empirically because people think that they're too extreme. 90% of America believes universal background checks will be beneficial. 74% of NRA members support background checks. If the NRA were to backlash against this extremely popular policy, they would only see a decrease in support for themselves. The third turn comes from Hirsch in 2013, who says that the best way to breed success is other success. When we pass gun control policy, we see other policies getting passed. This is the most responsive because they talk about their impacts, how we're going to have more conservative policies like concealed carry rights. However, realize empirically, the Democratic Violent Crime Act was passed a year after the Brady Act was passed per Graves. When you see more liberals passing more gun policies and finding successes in these policies being effective, you see that you lead to even more liberal policy down the road. But then the first impact of the first subpoint comes from saying that the ATF will be defunded. Realize Gambino tells you that the ATF was defunded during Obama's presidency for other reasons besides NRA riders on universal background checks. It's non-unique. However, they read you this card that says that 8% of dealers account for the majority of handguns. You flow that to our side. We only have to solve for 8% to solve the majority of handgun violence. But then into their subpoint B about long term. Remember, first of all, the 2 turns. Their internal warrant here is NRA electioneering. If we solve for this, we win today's round and this offense. Remember, it's non-unique in their role, but we give you at least a risk of offensive solving. Second, they never impact this out well. Remember the turn that success breeds success. We provide a much more empirical warrant as to why passing universal background checks actually leads to more liberal policies. But then onto the impacts. They first tell you that voters vote solely on gun issues. However, Allen writes in 2016 that even if that only 26% of voters say that their primary voting issue is gun rights. That's not the majority of voters. But secondly, their only really impact here is concealed carry gun rights. It's completely non-unique. The NRA will always be pushing for these. They already happened in Arizona. They provide you no reasons why universal background checks specifically triggers this. However, they then go on to talk about how grassroots movements lead to progress and how they'll be squashed by NRA backlash. Realize, once again, these grassroots movements are only effective in liberal states that are already prone to passing gun policy. This has absolutely no impact. There's no impact of contention. The real reason you vote in this round is the impact of lives, which far outweighs any of the impacts they give you because they're irreversible and they actually happen. Remember, we provide you empirical evidence about how Sorry, that's time. Anyway, Connecticut had a 40% decrease in violence once they passed background checks. For those reasons, we affirm.
Yep.
Do you guys see black now?
What color?
It was black.
Oh, never mind. I have green and blue if you want.
I can use green. She has green. That works.
Mine was better.
So, keeping with the tradition, since this is like, I think, our first final round, I'd like to just give a big thank yous. It's also probably going to be our last, but no, hopefully not. So, obviously, like, as like Ahana mentioned, we come from a very small school. About 2 years ago, our travel program did not exist. We never competed on the national level before that. So, Ahana and I are extremely fortunate not only to have found the support of Mr. Prine, who is here, and Ms. Shaw, who also is very active in the speech and debate program, for helping build our program, but we're also just so thankful for everything, like all of the help from the community. Shout out to our debate and NDF, and just in general community support from people such as Miranda to Gabe Ross to Sam Wood, and so many other people. Also, I'd like to thank my parents for putting down the payments to let me go to these tournaments all the time and every weekend, and for putting up for me. I'd like to thank all my teachers at school for also putting up for my lack of doing work on time. So, Mr. Hughes, if you're watching this, please accept my late astronomy homework so I can get an A in the class. And yeah, that's just about it. Is everyone ready? It's going to go Afneg. Overview on the app, and then Afneg. Start with an overview. Bodegrad of Roger Williams University in 2008 finds that failed policy feeds back into the NRA's justification as to why guns are necessary, killing support for anti-gun movements that actually limit violence. This means that any defense that we win in the round is offense for us, because the NRA just hones in on that one issue to bolster its opposition to future reforms in gun control. But let's go on to my opponent's first contention about closing loopholes. Their first subpoint is private sales, but recognize that if there are universal background checks, criminals will just go to bad apple dealers and still get guns, and these problems exist in the status quo. What Daniel Webster of Johns Hopkins University explains is that 1% of federally licensed gun dealers are responsible for 60% of the guns used in crimes. These dealers are already supposed to be using background checks under current law, meaning that voting pro won't change the nature of bad apple dealers breaking the law. This is terminal defense to their case, and you prefer this evidence over their Winchmeat 40% statistic because their 40% statistic has been previously found to be old and have very limited data, so it's been debunked. On the second subpoint about an increase in price, there are two elements to the pricing of the gun market. In legal channels, the fear of future gun control increases the demand for guns right now. What Fane of the Nation in 2012 explains is that when people see that there is gun control on the horizon, or that there is support for additional control measures, consumers believe that they will not be able to buy guns in the future and will thus double down on the purchasing of guns now. This also responds to their price argument because the determinant of price elasticity is consumer expectations. If gun buyers believe that their rights are threatened, demand becomes inelastic and consumers are more willing to double down and bite the cost of the increase in price. But on the illegal side, on the supply side, recognize that making guns scarcer actually increases crime. What Cook of Duke University explains is that if the availability of illicit goods decreases due to regulations, the net payoff to theft will increase as these goods are on net more expensive due to renewed scarcity. In the context of guns, the constraining of the supply of guns will 1. Encourage criminals to obtain guns illegally through theft because they're priced out of the black market, meaningfully increasing crime, and 2. Will encourage illegal arms suppliers to steal and traffic more arms because of the higher price. But on the demand side of the illegal market, the demand for guns by criminals is inelastic. What Seibert of the University of Chicago in 2013 explains is that because criminals are always intent on following through with their crime, the demand for guns is relatively inelastic, meaning that they will continue to purchase guns even if price increases substantially. On their third warrant about deterrence, recognize that Fidelity of the Herald in 2017 finds that the use of identity theft is making it easier for criminals to circumvent background checks by claiming to be someone else they're not. Criminals can easily get around the checks. But secondly, criminalization does not equate to deterrence. Because of a lack of enforcement, most people would not be deterred from an illegal purchase. Just like pirating music and movies is illegal, because these crimes are rarely prosecuted, people still pirate online. But finally, it is impossible to track guns because that's the source of the background check, because there is no gun registry and all records are deleted after 24 hours from the sale. Also, criminals can just scratch off the serial number, which is why there's absolutely no deterrence factor. On their fourth subpoint about trafficking, recognize that states of the Foundation of National Progress in 2016 finds that the reason gun trafficking is so prevalent within America is not due to a lack of gun control laws, but rather because the United States hardly prosecutes illegal gun trafficking, resulting in no legal penalties for illegal gun trades. But you can also cross-apply all of my responses to the illegal side for the gun market on their second warrant. But on their first impact about homicides, their evidence about a decrease in homicides is the first example of a recurring problem in their case. Their evidence ignores a lot of factors such as time series in which these states should have already had less guns or less shootings before the policy change. They also don't account for important variables such as poverty and proportion of guns across states. But on their second impact about inter-partner violence, first of all, Mays of UCLA in 2014 explains that because Americans live in households with existing guns and may not need to legally purchase a firearm to carry out a violent act if so inclined, there is no way that it can actually solve for interpersonal violence. But you can also look to the time frame analysis. What the Kraut Law Group explains is that most domestic abusers have no prior criminal record. This is important because most people who later commit domestic abuse can first purchase the gun legally and then pass a background check because they haven't previously committed a crime. But on this idea of reducing mass shootings, closing the loophole would do absolutely nothing. What Garrity of the National Review in 2017 finds is that in every mass shooting in recent years, the perpetrator had no criminal record or record of mental illness that would have barred the purchase of a firearm. Let's go back to my case. They say that the NRA always has the incentive to pass riders, but recognize that they have no incentive until we pass more gun laws that they need to gut back and dial back. Then they cite Murphy saying that the NRA has power to mobilize because of violence and that they solve bad for this. Recognize that it's not necessarily the power of the NRA, but rather the perception of previous power of the NRA. That's the Scott evidence is that the perception of the NRA being powerful leads to policy influence. That also responds to the Trumbull analysis, which is also dependent on the 74% of NRA members supporting gun background checks, but realize that first of all, this study is outdated. The NRA controls the narrative of these views of the people, which is why Guardino said in 2017 that most people oppose gun control from the NRA and background checks specifically. It's also a really bad poll question in general, thus we negate.
Really quickly before we start, what's the date on Garrity?
The NRA opposes background check?
No, that no past mass shooters would have been caught by
2017.
Okay. Right. Can I get the first question?
Yep.
Okay. I'm just gonna get timer. Okay. You talk about gun spikes and how demand is elastic and like will just lead to like more guns, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like what's the internal reason for why, first of all, an increase in violence leads to more people buying guns, and second of all, like why the NRA is allowed to tell people to continue buying guns?
So we don't. I'm confused about the first part of your question because our link into more people buying guns isn't an increase in violence.
No, like what we're telling you is that what you say is that like federal restrictions lead to gun spikes, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're asking you, why do those federal restrictions scare people?
Those federal restrictions scare people because of the perception that their fundamental rights are being
And why do
violated.
they feel
It's
like
not
they
a
need those
perception
rights?
of violence, but rather because the Second Amendment and America's obsession with guns dates back to Paul Revere in the Revolutionary War, and it's just America's core values that is sustained to the 21st century. That's why they're afraid. So now I'd like to ask you a question. Yeah, so let's talk about how only... Actually, yeah, let's talk about this Trumbull analysis, about like 74% of NRA members support universal
Trumbull
background
doesn't
check.
say that. We use that as analysis.
Oh,
for
sorry,
Trumbull.
the Center for American Progress card, the 74%
Yeah.
support. Okay, so what was the actual poll question asked?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure you can tell me.
Yeah, so it wasn't asking about whether or not people prefer a universal background check, but rather, do we want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals? So insofar as, like, it was a very broad poll question, not specific to a policy, how can we apply it to generalized support
We
of a
would still
background check?
extend the 90% of Americans who support universal background checks, and also Trumbull, who tell you specifically that when the NRA backlashes against popular policies, they have a 40% decrease in reported support.
Right, but if the poll itself isn't
You're
actually
talking about
asking...
the NRA poll. I'm talking about the poll of 90%
It's still the
of
same
Americans.
Center for American Progress poll. It's
No,
like the
what?
same 90% and 74%
I can give you
are
like
the
our
same.
card. It's from PolitiFact, not the Center for American
Yeah,
Progress.
but when is that PolitiFact article citing Center for American
No,
Progress? Okay.
they're citing some senator and then they make some analysis. They
Oh, so
confirm
then
it's
there's
true.
like, lost in translation telephone. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Okay, you talk about how domestic abusers don't typically have a record of past violence, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so like we read you in case that the way that they get caught by background checks is when people have a restraining order against them for domestic violence and then they get caught. Like, do the majority of criminals have how does this respond to the link at all?
So the argument is that most people who would commit domestic abuse don't have restraining orders initially or will have access to guns before the
Does the
restraining
card
orders
say
are
that
put
though?
on.
Because you read it in
But-
rebuttal as no criminal record, not no restraining order.
Well, also restraining orders don't show up on universal background
Yeah,
checks.
they
It
do.
is mental
That's
health
what the card
or
specifically
criminal
tells
records.
you. That when they have a restraining order because of a domestic violence charge.
Okay, I'd love to see that evidence.
Yeah, you
after.
can get it after class. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so you say that only 26% of people are single issue voters on guns, and you say
Yeah.
that's not enough to sway the entire population.
Mhm.
But if we're talking about specific races in in swing states and in conservative states, wouldn't that 26% be enough to swing the vote one way or another?
Sure, but we contend that though, if you contend that they're so politically active, they're going to be voting for like Republican anyways.
Unless they're energized to do so because the universal background check was passed. Yeah, I'd like to see that evidence.
Yeah, let me look that up first. What was it again?
It was
The restraining
that
order.
restraining orders appear.
Can you
Could
give it to
include
me?
the sample size.
Do you want us to just pull up the full?
Yeah, but if you could just like highlight the sample size.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure the card says my study found and the links to the study. Would you just like to look at the study?
It's no, it's just the cut card.
So it's Sergeant. Yeah, Sergeant.
That's all cool.
Yep.
Take a Okay.
Okay, we're gonna continue taking notes.
We'll start now. Like our American culture was once intertwined with race and society. Yeah, they don't respond to that. Yeah. Because it's 10 years. That's like Oh wait, really quickly, can we see the indite to the Connecticut card?
That's just what do you mean?
Like, can you point to me where in the card it has like a small sample size and like what was the other?
Oh,
one
the
again?
small sample size was the win to mute evidence. But that was just based on a separate issue.
Oh, okay, that's fine. We'll continue taking the one. We've got 136 takes.
How much do you guys have?
2 minus 30, 136, so
Okay, yeah.
24.
Okay. It's gonna go neg, extending some responses.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah.
Now we're at 130.
So it's gonna go neg and then F. With that being said, time starts now. Extend the overview that Megan gives you in rebuttal. The neg can only account for liberal states who are already going to pass gun control anyway. It happens in either world. The only risk of offense is solving for these 23 conservative states who are anti-gun control. We're the team that's actually enforcing these policies in these conservative states. They never solve for this. They never even touch it. But then let's go into a few key terms to remember. Realize first, the NRA backlash always happens in either world. The only way to weaken the NRA is for the three key terms that Megan reads you in rebuttal. The first is the first is Murphy, who tells us that decreasing gun violence means that we're decreasing the narrative of the NRA. They say it's about perception of the NRA being powerful, but this makes absolutely no sense. We're talking about the specific narrative of the NRA that uses gun violence as a reason why people should buy guns, because it's self-defense, right? So if we decrease gun violence in the long term, we decrease this narrative and we weaken the NRA. But then Tremble, who tells us that this is we say that there's a 40% decrease in support empirically when they pass something that is unpopular, right? And we tell you that 90% of Americans are pro UBCs, which means that if the NRA passes something that is unpopular, their support will decrease by 40% like it has in the past. It has nothing to do with how many NRA supporters support UBCs. It's about the people. But then let's go on to a few key impact mitigation things that she reads. First, on concealed carry rights. Remember, the NRA will always be pushing for these concealed carry rights. It happens in either world. No matter any gun policy is going to pass, they're always going to go for this. But then remember, the only effective way to use grassroots, it's only effective in liberal states. Again, they do not account for conservative states whatsoever. So all of these are completely mitigated. But then onto our case. Remember this overview, they say that failed policy leads to NRA backlash, defense is offense. We are the only team that actually gives empirics as to why these policies will not actually fail. They will succeed. We give you, remember, there's going to be a 19% decrease in intimate partner violence and a 40% decrease in homicide. Prefer our actual empirics about it not failing over their conjecture. But then, remember, onto private sales, they said people who go to bad apple dealers, remember deterrence, which is a key response to all of their front lines, right? That just the risk of actually having a felony prosecutable charge against you is enough not to buy a gun, is enough not to sell a gun to a criminal. So this response was essentially all the responses they give you. But then only extend private sales, deterrence, and interstate gun trafficking, not increase in price. We're going to drop that. But remember, we're the only team that gives you quantifiable impacts. That's why you got to vote F.
Okay, is everybody ready? All right. Starting the overview that they dropped the entire round, that they can only impact you, the liberal states that are already prone to passing gun control policy, we tell you that at the very least, you have a risk of solvency in the 23 states that currently don't pass gun control policy because they're conservative states. They never solve for that. Their impacts are a wash because the only place they actually occur is in liberal states. 2 reasons to vote for us. One is off of their case. 2 key turns. One from Murphy, who says that the narrative behind why the NRA is powerful, behind why gun spikes happen, is because people look at gun violence and think that they then need to go buy guns to defend themselves. Murphy tells you explicitly, buy this over their analysis of American culture. That takes out their turns on our case, but also it makes you realize that the only way to weaken the NRA is to take the risk of decreasing violence. That's the root. They never really respond to this in a nuanced way. But second is on Trumbull, who says that empirically there's a 40% decrease in reported support for the NRA when they backlash against popular policies. UBCs have a 90% following by the American public. They're going to lead to a backlash. The only thing that they say to this is that manufacturers are the ones who really give the NRA their power. The NRA has absolutely no power if it can't mobilize voters. It has no lobbying power of Congress if it loses their voters. We tell you they lose their voters if they backlash against UBCs. You can vote for us there. Remember, the NRA is always going to advocate against gun control policy. We're the only one who gives you a unique route to decreasing that. The second way is our case off deterrence. Realize we tell you that deterrence on a federal level works. Their only responses comes from this pirating thing, but DeFilippis tells you that simply lying on a background check leads to 10 years in prison. That's enough deterrent for criminals to not go to the black market. Kirkham tells you that the accountability of buyers and sellers empirically leads to deterrence. All of their defense is mitigation because they dropped Hirsch, who says that empirically the Violent Crime Act was passed the year after the Brady Bill. Their whole impacts about state rollbacks don't actually happen in status quo. The real reason you vote for us is off of the Sergeant impact about how we cause a 19% decrease in intimate partner violence. That's the only impact they'll fill around because they don't address it in their summary, and they don't talk about any of their impacts in their summary either. Realize when you vote here, you're ending gender oppression and violence, but also that we only have to solve for 8% of sellers because they themselves tell you in case that 8% of sellers do the majority of crime. We would contend you take the risk of offense. Hannah Montana once said that nobody's perfect, but I've got to work it. I would say that's why you affirm.
All right, we'll take a remaining minute 10 of prep. Okay, there's. So it'll be like on the overview, like discussions wherever you flow those, and then it'll be pro-con. Okay. Is everyone ready? Yeah, so it's going to go wherever you flowed our two overviews, and like wherever like Ahana's was in the last, like I know that kind of probably got messy. So the overviews, and then it's going to be pro-con. Okay, we all good now? They send this overview about only liberal states, but we respond to this with BODRAD, which is that we impact on the federal level and all state policies. The risk of offense just isn't enough, because if there's even one idiom of, or like one increment of failure, the NRA blows that up into a big issue and uses that as a justification to not only cut this universal background check bill, but all other gun control policies. This is what that gutting looks like, but this is also mutually exclusive of the gutting argument. What we say is that deterrence just isn't enough on their case for criminals to not buy guns. They just don't care because they're already criminals. That's why Webster says in the status quo, 1% of legal sellers provide 60% of the guns used in crime. They just apply background checks to all sellers, but there's no increase in punishment. So A, we empirically disprove the deterrence because criminals are always going to buy guns and are already breaking the law and breaking the background check law. And B, criminals will still go to these bad apples in their world. This is just exacerbates the issue. But they never respond to the feign turn, which says that the fear of losing the right to bear arms increases the quantity demand and the purchases of guns in the legal market. This increases the number of guns available for homicides and interpersonal violence. So if you believe that gun violence is so bad right now because of the number of guns in the market, this only exacerbates that issue and leads to more death. Finally, they never respond to the quick turn that says that an increase in the scarcity of guns in the illegal market increases the value of those guns into suppliers. This A, incentivizes more people who are criminals to steal these guns because they're more valuable. That leads to more crime and violence. And B, it incentivizes further trafficking. But on the con case, they have a lot of turns talking about how they decrease the narrative of the NRA and decrease popular support. But none of this matters, because Donahue says that gun manufacturers are the very con universal background check, and public support doesn't matter because they don't influence the NRA or nor policy making. It's only the gun manufacturers. That's why after the Brady bill, you saw an increase in gun control being cut. Sierpin says that a hit list removes anyone who votes for gun control, and that stops policy that benefits gun violence from being passed. Scott also says that it's the mere perception of the NRA power that leads to the influence in policy. But there's a very separate link to the destructive policy making that they never respond to. They may push for these conceal and carry permits, but they're never passed unless it's a concession. That's what we did Hayes. It says that the GOP gets a concession with nationwide conceal carry laws with the passage of a universal background check bill. Then Brown says that increases more guns, and this controls the internal link to their entire case. And Donahue says you see a 15% increase in violent crime. And this also short circuits their interpersonal violence argument because people can get conceal and carry weapons or permits without passing a background check. So you only increase violence in the pro world. That's why we're proud to negate. Thank you.